Okay, welcome back. We're at task 6. This is for the module 10 architect course, uh, covering autoscaling. This is our guided lab. Always testing things, making sure they're working. So another test we're going to run, we looked at some tests earlier. Now we're going to run a test. What happens when we terminate an instance? So let's say an instance is marked as unhealthy, right? We're going to make one unhealthy by terminating it, and we'll see that it gets marked unhealthy, um, and then it'll ultimately replaced. So here we can see our target group, and we can see that we have two healthy instances, which matches with the auto scaling details where we define the desired capacity as 2. If we take a look here, we can see it's still healthy. Great. And so what we're going to do here is trigger an auto scale event to replace the failed instance. So I'm going to make it look like it failed. So what I'm going to do here is click on this link. That'll take me to an instance, and then I'm going to go ahead and terminate the instance. Okay. And we'll go ahead and delete it. So we've initiated the termination. And if I go to my instances list, we should see that it's in the process of shutting down. Right. You can see there's actually some other ones that had previously terminated. Because if an EC2 instance is marked as unresponsive, that's what it should do. Now, it's possible during the launch of the autoscale group that it wasn't connecting to or the load balancer wasn't able to determine that it was healthy because it was still launching. So then the load balancer could mark it as failed. We did a few things to get it to fail quickly and come back quickly. So some things we played with potentially triggered some of those failures. So if we take a look here, we'll ultimately see that it terminates, right? So if we take a look here, we only have one inventory app server. In fact, let's do this. Let's filter for just that, so we're not looking at the other one. Okay, so we're only seeing that, right? So looks like it's initializing a new server. So let's go to the auto scale group. We'll refresh this and we'll see that one was marked as unhealthy. 2 are in service. And if I take a look at my activity here, I should see all kinds of log messages. So this is when I terminated the EC2 instance, and you can see it's doing what's called connection draining. So when I manually terminated it, uh, auto scaling and load balancing will, load balancer will stop sending traffic to the EC2 instance, right? So it's going to wait for that load balancer to complete any transactions that it had with the EC2 instance on behalf of an external client. And once that completes, meaning that connection is drained, because there may be multiple connections, right? What if there were 10 or more connections from different clients connecting to the application running on the EC2 instance? We got it since I terminated it, right? It didn't just fail. I terminated the instance. Uh, the autoscale group isn't just going to immediately kill it if there's still traffic. So it would queue it to be terminated, and then it will and it will notify the load balancer that that's being terminated. The load balancer will stop sending new connection requests to that EC2 instance and wait until all connections or transactions have been completed and then terminated. That's what they mean by connection draining. Okay. In the meantime, it could begin deploying a new instance in preparation for this to be replaced. This is great because there are times where you do want to terminate the instance because you're replacing them. So let's say that you did an update, and so you have a new AMI. So you created a new version of your launch template. And so you launch new instances first by terminating the old ones, and then it would go through the autoscale group, and the load balancer would go through this process of replacing those older EC2 instances with new EC2 instances using the new launch template pointing to the new AMI. So we get deployed with a new update. So this is a great way of manually updating everything. Okay. Ultimately, we should see that our target group has two instances. Now, this is the old information. Notice that one of these is going to get replaced. Okay. There was that target deregistration. So the 209 is the one we have. We should see that that 209 is still there, and then the other one was replaced. Okay. And so we have two healthy instances, two healthy targets. Okay. And if I go to my inventory, I should see and you can see as I hit that refresh, it keeps adding records. And I'm looking to see that it is in fact using both instances in both availability zones. So it's now replaced that.